Welcome to another episode of Mission Compliance, Unleashing Growth Potential for Defense Contractors. In today's episode, we continue down the road of understanding CMMC, its regulations, and controls. Up next is AU L2-3.3.4, Alert in the event of an audit logging process failure. We'll break down what this control means, why it matters, and how it impacts your organization's cybersecurity posture. We'll also provide practical insights and strategies for achieving compliance and securing your systems effectively. So whether you're a defense contractor aiming to win more contracts or simply someone interested in bolstering your cybersecurity knowledge, you're in the right place. Bazinga! We're joined once again today by Mike Frieder, President of On-Call Compliance Solutions and a CMMC Professional Assessor. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
So, Mike, in the previous control, we talked about reviewing event logs, and today we're talking about alerts in the event of a logging failure. So, to get our listeners and viewers off on the right track, why is it important to report an audit logging failure?
Yeah, great question. And I think we talked the last time when we were going through Control 3.3.3 about the idea that we're getting into a family of controls that really sort of begins to lay out precisely how systems should be monitored and how systems need to have a proactive capability to them in terms of spotting anomalous behavior. That is, behavior that is not necessarily malicious, right? So like a virus execution would be malicious, and you have antivirus for that, which is reactive. This is proactive stuff. This is, hey, this is what's going on in your system, and alerting you as to when you should be taking a minute to investigate something strange going on. Like, let's say there's the administrative login at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that's abnormal. Or let's say we've got a user whose permissions escalated from standard user to administrator. That should be investigated. Or maybe you've got a connection into your network from China or some other foreign country, and that's unusual, and that should be investigated. That is really the basis for switching from reactive to proactive. It's a big step up in network management security and a big step up in, honestly, company-wide maturity. And it's something that, frankly, most basic, I don't want to say basic, but most IT people really don't, unless they've dealt with high security environments before, this is net new to them. This is a new concept. So I think it's really good that in this they take some controls to really spell out precisely how this should work. I remember years and years ago, I had a conversation with a guy named Gary just saying that wrote 70% in this SB 800-171. And I said, Gary, like I'm putting together what you're picking up, right? It seems to me like there really is no way to be compliant with this without having a SIEM solution in place. But could you check my head real quick? Is there a way? And he kind of more or less said to me, no, not really. That's the whole point of why we detailed out so many controls, that deal with having those logs come into a central repository, having that massive log files be cut down into useful information. Now we find in 3.3.4 alerting in the event of an audit logging process failure that we're literally putting a specific control in place to make sure that if there's a failure to receive the logs properly, then we're going to get an alert about that, because the first thing that an attacker might do is shut down those SIEM processes that would ordinarily alert an IT admin to go take a look at something. It's kind of very much like a criminal walking into the jewelry store and immediately smashing the security camera. That would be, kind of a red alert sort of moment, because now we've lost our eyes and ears. So that's why this control exists. It's why it's so important. Whatever system you're using, we're really big fans of things like Rocket Cyber and Arctic Wolf and Microsoft Sentinel. They all have these capabilities when it comes to making the IT admin aware that there's a problem in the process. It's not just good enough to have, get an alert when there's a problem because something malicious is happening. We have to simply get an alert when our systems aren't working correctly, because otherwise we might have, again, a covered security camera in the proverbial jewelry safe. So we just don't want to, we don't want to leave our system open to being ignored. Huge part of security, right? Don't ignore your security controls. And That's really what a lot of 3.3.4 is about.
Awesome. So let's jump right into it. What are the key assessment points on this one that an assessor would be looking for?
Yeah, so there's three elements or three different things that get assessed on this particular control. First is determine if personnel or roles to be alerted in the event of an audit logging process failure are identified. In other words, do you have some kind of user that has the role of monitoring the SIEM solution or any other solutions you have that monitor for security? And again, we would answer this by saying, hey, listen, it's implemented via the SIEM solution. Only authorized SIEM administrators receive these alerts. Obviously, you've got to put usernames into the SIEM system, and that's a really clear way to do it. Another place you could look is a job description. As part of someone's job description to monitor alerts. If not, that could be a really obvious point that an assessor could call you out on. So a lot of different ways to answer it. There's two good ones. Next assessment point is determine if types of audit logging process failures for which alert will be generated are defined. Do you have something in your system that is defined as to when audit logging process failures happen? Because there's a lot of different kinds of failures. You could have some kind of a threshold, like if there have been no logs received within an hour, alert on that. Maybe it's not time-based. Maybe it is if there's an interruption in the connection, then we're alerting on that. Again, it really is kind of a nitty-gritty detail, but your SIEM solution should define all of those different things, and you've got to be able to prove that to an assessor. So again, understanding the different types of audit logging process failures are important. Finally, determine if identified personnel or roles are alerted in the event of an audit logging process failure. I call this a proof of concept. So again, the assessor is going to have to determine that your people are actually getting the alerts, and that the people who are identified as supposed to get the alerts actually are getting them. Again, easy button there is just going to be look in the SIEM solution, look at who's being alerted, and we can again send a screenshot of that to the assessor. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy control. But again, it's a vitally important piece of security. And again, those analogies of busting out the security camera, at the jewelry store, I think that's a really good analogy. You just can't have a missing piece of your coverage in a true layered security approach. And that's really what 3.3.4 is going to go on to. And you know what? There's going to be more. So again, I think we'll do a future podcast on 3.3.5. There's more stuff that's very crystal clear defined in terms of what it is that this solution, this SIEM solution has to do in order to be compliant. It is very specific, in NIST. And so it's interesting too, because some of the controls are very tightly defined like this. Some of the controls are very loose in their application and allow for a lot of different ways to solve for things. But this one is very specific, and it honestly just makes sense.
Right. So, with that being said, you said it's pretty straightforward. Are there any potential difficulties that an organization might encounter when enacting this particular control?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of difficulties. Number one is, and kind of going back to what we talked about and will talk about on future controls related to SIEM, you have a cultural shift, right? So you have a cultural shift from bad stuff happens and I react and that's my job to my job is to make it so bad stuff doesn't happen. And that requires, in some cases, additional personnel. It requires additional financial resources because someone has to be able to do something with these alerts when they happen. And again, we find that a lot of defense companies are very reluctant to put additional funding in to cybersecurity, and including when it comes to personnel, they're very sensitive to that. They want to do as much as they can with as few hands as they can on the IT side. And what I find very interesting about that, and always have, IT and cybersecurity still are under 1% of gross revenue in almost every client that we work with. I can't say that for every client, but it's really close to every client. And it's just not really a great expense. Yet it's one of the most scrutinized expenses on the balance sheet. They just go security. Well, that costs money, and we could probably lessen the amount of money we spend on that and be more profitable. Yeah, a great logical conclusion until you consider the risks that are really in play here. What I find very interesting is when we work with large clients, like in the thousands of employees, they are always in a situation where they have a really robust IT department and almost have a situation where they're overemployed on that front. Why is that? Well, the answer comes down to one word, which is very relevant to our podcast series here, which is risk. Large companies have a lot to lose. When they have a lot to lose, they understand that they cannot really afford to have a major disaster. They just can't do it. So what happens is they wind up in a scenario where they finally begin to do real risk management, which is something that DFARS and NIST force every defense contractor, regardless of size, to look at heavily. And they begin to realize, wow, I need to put proper resources behind all this, information security stuff that could take my company down. So I always find it interesting that the big companies always have the resources and the little companies, they just don't really understand how to justify the spend internally to management. But if management was smart, they would look at what it is that, big companies do who are in their space. And I think that they would find that it's that they adequately and almost more than adequately resource security. Because again, it's real hard to make payroll when your computers don't work. And realistically, by the time a company gets to be larger, they've been through some really terrible information security event. So I think that's probably, particularly on the small to mid-sized companies, we see more resistance here on the SIEM solutions. They go, what do I need that expense for? I've never had it before, don't need it. And the big companies kind of laugh and go, well, we've been through the worst in our history. We know exactly why we need this kind of thing. And so as a result, I think that for large companies, this will be very easy to implement if they don't already have it. And I think for small to mid-sized companies, they'll balk at the price, they'll balk at the resources truly required to do this right. And I think that they've just got to recognize that you either have to charge more money, be a bigger company, or, I think the most popular decision for them is typically outsourcing to a company like us. I mean, at On-Call, we run a very large managed SIEM and SOC setup for our clients. We have hundreds of companies that are being monitored and managed every day, and it's a tremendous, tremendous savings. You can't get at the efficiencies of scale that we have having thousands and thousands of endpoints under management when you're a 50-person company. You just can't. And so it really makes sense to outsource this when you're smaller. When you've got 500 or more employees, it begins to make more sense. So I think that's another really key challenge of implementation is recognizing when it's time to outsource this versus insource this. So yeah, I think those are some really, really good challenges. And I think that overall, not really all that hard. There's one more challenge I think is really worthwhile mentioning, which is I cannot count the number of times we've been through clients who implemented a SIEM solution and never really configured it. So in other words, they got the funding approved, they bought the tool, maybe they even went so far as to set up the agents on all the workstations and firewalls and whatnot that they need to, and they never even actually look at what it is that they're monitoring and managing. Wild. But it happens. It happens so often. Again, I particularly point to those companies that are at 500 employees and less. There's typically free tech support or tech support included in the licensing when you buy solutions like this. And the one thing, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're one of those, IT directors who's just busy, overworked, et cetera, and you haven't carved out the time to look at your security solutions lately and actually see how they're configured, take this as your beckoning call. And if you don't have time to do it, you know what? Give us a call. Let's, look, it's not a really huge retainer or anything like that. Let's come to a consult. Let's overview everything. And let's just eyeball that stuff. I mean, it's the same thing we do with backups. Anytime we touch a new client, the first thing we look at is backups. Because I can fix any problem there is if I got a good backup. But if I don't have it, everybody in that boat is kind of up the creek. So, yeah, would really strongly emphasize the idea that remember, no matter what the marketing says, a SIEM solution is something that requires advanced configuration and customization to any environment to get it to truly be a meaningful and useful solution for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Mike, you know what comes next for our longtime listeners and viewers of the podcast. You know what's next. It's our favorite time of the podcast where we try to take all this stuff, all this compliance stuff that can generally be a little bit dry at times, a little bit worse for wear, but and then we try to ask a silly question that may or may not be related to the topic at all, but Mike is usually pretty good at wheeling it back around and and Mike, you actually leaned right into my question with something you said in that last answer. You use the word disaster, which you can describe a lot of these controls and all, and this whole compliance thing. That if you don't have it, a lot of the cybersecurity stuff, if you're not compliant, if you don't have those proper cybersecurity measures, it can be a disaster for your company, for your business, whatever. And one of the best disaster movies ever made, and one of my personal favorites, was Twister. And so, with that being said,
By the way,
what?
I knew you were going to the Twister route. I knew it was out of there.
Yep. Thank you very much, Helen Hunt, Bill Paxton. We love you. Anyway, with that being said, with that being said, what if you installed a tornado siren to go off in the office if a logged failure is detected?
It's a good question. You know, speaking of which, before I get into that, Helen Hunt, what happened to Helen Hunt? She had like a couple of really great movies, right? She had, was it Contact?
She was one of the it people for like the 90s. And
Yeah.
then, just time moves on. And she did Twister. She was in a show with Paul Reiser called Mad About You. She did I think it was called What Women Want with Jack Nicholson. Couple yeah, she had a run there for a while. But I think she's pretty much retired now from acting, so
I thought Twister was so brilliant, and I thought that space movie that came right after it, I think it was called Contact. You
yeah.
know, I thought her acting in that was just superb.
No,
Um,
Twister still holds up as one of the best disaster movies ever made, and obviously the sequel to Twister just came out called Twisters, and Helen Hunt's not in it, but it holds up as well. But even if you go back and watch Twister now, you're like, man, this movie's still great. These effects are still great, and obviously there's the iconic line of, "I I've got to go. We've got cows."
yeah,
When
yeah,
the
yeah.
woman's on the phone in the back of the truck. So.
Or I think
It's just a classic.
or I think maybe one of the most famous and well thought out branding deals ever was in that movie when they showed the Pepsi sign with the little data gathering balls that they flew up into the tornado and it turns
Oh,
into a Pepsi
100%.
sign.
Yeah.
That was I remember actually being a young I don't know if I was a young man or a young kid. I can't remember. I was probably a kid. But I remember seeing that and I asked my parents about that and we were Coca-Cola people, right? We were from the South.
Yeah.
Tallahassee, Florida. We were a Coke family. And it was a Pepsi sign that spun up in that thing. And I asked my parents, I was like, well, yeah, sure does look like a Pepsi sign. And they said, yeah, that's really good marketing. That was done on purpose. And like this light bulb clicked in my head. I'm like, whoa, people do things to give people ideas in movies. This is insane. It blew my mind, actually. It made me quite interested in marketing for a very short time. And then I probably fell off and went back to playing with toys. But anyway,
Well, well, there's an easy answer to that question. How old were you in 1996?
I have no idea. I would have to
Because
do some.
that's how old you would have been.
Let's
But
see here. I was born in 82. So I guess I was like 16, right?
there you go, perfect age. But, and this is a little nerdy tangent here, but there's a fun fact about the movie Twister that always it fascinates me is that the opening scene of the movie when Helen Hunt's character is a little girl and her parents, it's like the 70s, I think. I think it's like 78 or something like that, or 76. And her and her parents are in the thing, and her dad gets sucked up in the tornado. Because they're in the cellar, it rips the door off, he gets in, whatever. Before that happens, the dad is watching the news and he talks about, oh, they're saying this tornado could be an F5, right? And like this, it could be this big one, it could be an F5. The problem with that is that I think that scene took place, like I said, in 76 or something like that, is that the scale that would have classified the tornado as an F5 or an F anything would not have been established until a few years after that opening scene.
Oh, interesting. I didn't
So
know
it's a
that. That's a good piece
so
of
it's a
trivia.
little bit of a gaffe on the writer's part to put that in, because
That's
the scene takes place a couple of years before the scale's invented. Anyway,
that's a
anyway.
good one. You know,
Eh,
so getting back to your funny question of the week, which is actually it's a funny question, but it's really not. It's a good question. It's actually a really good question, which is, how do you know or how do you set up your SIEM system to send out an alert that your help desk will actually pay attention to? And I have to tell you, that's a really, really good question. So I know it was probably meant as, a little play on the old Twister thing, but I got to get serious for a minute with that answer because we run a help desk that sees probably 1,000 tickets a week, something like that. I don't even know what we're up to, but it's a lot. And that's a lot of noise and it's a lot of people involved. And, I would probably venture to guess that we're probably running more service tickets than 99.9% of defense contracting companies are. But that doesn't matter because there's other managed IT service providers out there in the world. And, look, we're a particularly large one by ticket volume, but the reality is, what do you do to make sure that when an alert comes in, it's not ignored? And I've talked a lot about, in answer number three, the idea of resource planning and you have to adequately resource this. I don't care how big or small you are. It doesn't matter if you outsource all of your IT or that you have a massive IT department. This is a real challenge, and it's the challenge of noise. It's much like advertising. It used to be that it would take 7 touches to get a response out of somebody when you're marketing to them. Now you need 12 touches to get a response. And usually it's 12 touches and a couple of phone calls. And so that's a very real question. I'll tell you that, at our company, we run an entirely separate ticketing board with entirely dedicated representatives to watch over tickets that come from a SIEM solution or a security information event management solution. And then those alerts, each alert is set up with a severity level. So we rank the vulnerabilities or incidents that come across our SIEM solutions for our clients and make sure that those different incidents are not all at the same level, making them blend together. Those are two ways that I think you can really sound the tornado drill, if you will, when it comes to the alerting, because it is really, I'll tell you what, next to the SIEM solution that's just sort of out of the box configured, the next great challenge is to configure the SIEM solution in such a way that the alerts mean something and that it's not just spewing noise. Um, and so I think that the idea of a tornado alarm is highly relevant, especially in this day and age when your IT people may be geographically dispersed. How do you make it stand out on somebody's screen, right? When there aren't 4 people in a cubicle setup who would kind of turn around and look at each other and go, "Hey man, did you see that? No, yeah, we should investigate that." Right? That all takes place via typing in Slack now. So, one, issue severity level, or apply a ranking of severity to your SIEM tickets. Two is have someone understand that that they're dedicated to looking at those security alerts. For instance, we have a dedicated security officer in our company. We're not that big, but we have a dedicated security officer. That guy's entire job is to deal with nothing but security alerts and security incidents. That's his job. Um, and then when he's dealing with a security incident, then we have other people in our company who kick in and take over watching the alerts to make sure that there's nothing spreading, to make sure that everything is good. So, we have a lot of little alarm bells that we program into our company and that you should program into yours as a defense contractor. And if you're real small and you're outsourcing this, you may want to ask the question, hey, tell me about your incident response plan, right? So that's another requirement down the line that we'll talk about is you got to have an incident response plan. And the incident response plan has to get executed over and over again for every time one of these SIEM alerts comes in. Your incident response plan should be dictating how that alarm bell is sounded. So I know that was supposed to be a silly question, but actually it's a really good question because um, again, we just go back to the movies, right? Like if no one's watching the security cameras because there's 20 cameras on a wall of TVs, and someone doesn't notice that one of the cameras isn't working because it got busted out by a criminal while they're stealing jewelry out of the safe, or someone threw a sweatshirt over the camera, as they're getting people in the door. That's like, this is like the digital version of that. So we've got to have people that are really not just monitoring, but when the alerts come through, the alerts have got to mean something.
Well, this is how we do this here. I look at the title. I barely pay attention to the title of the control until I'm reading it for the first time. That's why I struggle with it sometimes, especially if it's long. I take one word out of it. I come up with a question that basically has nothing to do with the actual thing we're talking about. I just use that buzzword. And in this case, I just looked for an excuse to talk about how much I love the movie Twister, and you made it into an incredibly relevant answer, an answer that fits, an answer that makes sense. That's how we do it here. One of us is just trying to come up with stuff to say, and the other one knows what to say and nails it on the head every time. That's just what we do here at the Mission Compliance Podcast.
That's it. Always having fun.
And that wraps up another great episode of And that wraps up another great episode of Mission Compliance. We hope our discussion today has provided you with valuable insights, practical strategies, and inspiration to navigate the ever-evolving world of defense. We'd like to extend our appreciation to Mike for joining us, talking about the importance of detecting and reporting audit logging failure, and for once having seen and appreciated a movie that we're talking about on this podcast, because that's not usually what happens. Thanks, Mike.
That's a good point. You have to go back to when I was 16 and actually watched a movie.
There you go. There you go. But the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and connect with us on our social media channels. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and engage with fellow listeners using the hashtag Mission Compliance Podcast. If they haven't already, what should they do, Mike?
Well, they should like, comment, and subscribe.
You know what else you should do? You should go watch Twister. And then once you're done with that, go to the theaters or wherever it is now and watch Twisters. They're both good. But like Mike said, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform because that lets you know when new episodes like this one are released. And we'd also ask that you rate and review the show because your feedback helps us to continue to bring you thought-provoking episodes and high-quality content. Join us next time as we delve further into the dynamic world of defense, security, and industry innovation. Until then, take care, stay informed, and make compliance your mission. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.